Class today, but I hope to show you that when you study punctuation, especially when you study commas, you can pick up a lot of information about rhetorical devices, and you can pick up a lot of information about different types of sentence, different types of phrase, different types of clause. And why is this important? Well, because when I look at the criteria for getting a high mark in the writing in any exam, GCSE, IELTS, A-level, 11 plus, it really doesn't matter what the exam is, but you get a higher mark in any writing exam if you demonstrate in your text a wide range of phrases, clauses, parts of speech. Certainly it would be great if when I read an essay, I like to see inversion, correlative conjunctions, fronting of various types of phrase and clause, participles fronted, adverbials fronted sometimes, maybe even verbs and adjectives fronted. And so this is how you get a high mark in the exam, by using a wide range of sentences. But we're going to just look at commas now, and it's simply in order to hold on. It's just simply in order to have a look at some of the reasons why we use commas. But when we do this, we see lots of different phrases and clauses. And I want to see that in your writing, simply because I know you get a higher mark when you have a wide range of sentences. And I say this just because lots of times people say, how can I improve my writing? Or even, how can I improve my English? And my answer is grammar, a study of grammar. Yeah, that's how you improve it. I know that this went out of fashion for a long time. Grammar was considered total waste of time, but I want to bring it back in fashion because I can see that it's actually really useful, and certainly for improving your writing skills or your speaking skills. So let's look at this first sentence and think about where the commas go. This is from a website called Chomp Chomp. It's a great website for grammar, and I believe it's an American website aimed at school kids. And it shows that the Americans still teach a lot of grammar. Hi, Alia. So where do we put the commas in this first sentence? And I want to show you how using instinct is not the best way to get all the commas, because using instinct, I find people usually miss one or two here. And I'm sure I would if I were using my instincts. But it's not what editors are doing when they're making sure everything is punctuated correctly. And so it's not what you should be doing either, in my opinion. So where does the first comma go in this sentence? And a lot of people miss this. It goes before honey. And it goes before honey because honey is the name you are using to address this person. And when you directly address somebody as Dave, John, Peter, Sally, Professor, Captain, Honey, anytime you directly address them, you need a comma before the noun of direct address. Okay, so the first comma will go here, certainly. Don't worry, comma, honey. And then we need another comma here before the speech marks. And this comma is just for direct speech. And there is a simple rule for using commas with direct speech, which I can very quickly explain. If you get the said mum coming after the direct speech, then you have the comma inside the speech marks. But if you have mum said, and then the direct speech, it goes outside the speech marks. Okay, so that, if you just memorize those two things that I've just written, you've got direct speech commas covered. Okay, and please remember that if you have a question mark or an exclamation mark, then of course that replaces the comma. You don't have both. Yeah. And so it's only if you have no other punctuation there that you need a comma. But if you have a full stop or an exclamation mark or a question mark, that one won't be necessary. Okay, so what, one before honey and one after honey. And then if Rocky doesn't come home, we'll go to the Humane Society and pick out another cat. So it's tradition when you start with an incomplete thought, when you start with a subordinate clause, because if is a subordinating conjunction, which means it always starts an incomplete thought. It's tradition to have subordinate clause, comma, main clause. And so we need one more comma in this sentence after home. Yeah, if Rocky doesn't come home, comma, we'll go to the Humane Society and pick out another cat. And I agree there is a pause there, by the way, if anybody teaches commas by pausing. I do agree there is a pause there when we speak, but why do we pause? Surely we pause in order to show the listener, here is the end of my incomplete thought, my subordinate clause, and here is the start of my complete thought, my main clause. And I'll demonstrate that on the next question. Because if we go on to next sentence, because that's all that we can find in that one, have a look at this one. If you need a memo typed in a hurry, you should take it to Sharon, who has the fastest fingers of anyone in the office. Now, again, I don't think pausing will necessarily, well, I mean, maybe if you feel, yeah, look at this sentence. I want you to notice how you could pause in two different places in this sentence, just like you could put the comma in two different places in this sentence, but it does change the meaning. And so this is a good sentence to look at because it shows how commas are functioning. So on the one hand, we could say this. We could say, if you need a memo typed in a hurry, you should take it to Sharon. Now, I don't think that is the correct answer, but it could be. It could be that we mean in a hurry, take it to Sharon. In a hurry could be part of the main clause rather than the subordinate clause, in which case we'd have a comma after typed and we would pause in speech after typed. But we are pausing to show the listener that here is the end of my subclause, because of course it's more likely that we mean if you need a memo typed in a hurry, you should take it to Sharon. And if that's what we mean, we make the pause later to show the listener that this is the end of our subordinate clause and this is the start of our main clause. Agreed? Yeah. So I want to just show you this to show you that pausing is not the main thing. We pause for the clause. Clauses are the main thing. Yeah, that's the main reason why the comma's there. It's not pausing, it's clausing. Yeah, that makes sense. It's the clause and not the pause. But we do pause, and we pause because of the clause. Yeah, the clause is the main thing here. Okay, so comma after hurry for sub comma main. And then another comma is necessary here, and it goes after Sharon. And you should all focus on the who. Yeah, because who is a relative pronoun. Who, which, that, whose, whom. The 5 relative pronouns and where, when, why. The 3 relative adverbs. These are the words where you need to think. Relative clause. Relative clause. Is it defining or is it non-defining? And of course, this relative clause is non-defining. It's not defining which Sharon. We probably only know one Sharon. Yeah, and most people only know one Sharon. I don't even know if I know any Sharons. But if you only know one, then you're not defining which Sharon, of course. And we need a comma in a non-defining relative clause. And relative clauses ought to be in any decent piece of writing. Yeah, they're everywhere. You can find them on any page of any book. And so, of course, you need to be using some relative clauses in your writing, in your essays and in your creative writing. It's just one more structure. And if you use a wide range of structures, such as apositives, correlative conjunctions, subjunctive, inversion, if you're using lots of different structures, your writing becomes more engaging. And you demonstrate an original style. Yeah, and so this is why it's important. So one comma after Sharon for the non-defining relative clause. Now, I want to show you that it's not just on excellent websites like Chomp Chomp where you can practice commas. Actually, there are very few websites like Chomp Chomp with excellent exercises for commas. Very, very few. So what we'll do now is we'll look at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a very common GCSE text. And it's an excellent story, of course, as well. Let's have a look at this. Okay, can you see this nice and clear? Have I got it all nice and big for you guys? I've tried to focus so that everybody can see it nice and clearly. So I just want to examine the commas because I want to show you that you can take a text and you can analyze the usage of commas. Now, I must admit, in this text, it's quite an old text, and there's one particular comma which is certainly considered wrong nowadays, which you often see. Let me just quickly show you. It depends on the version of the book that you have. Now, in this version, at the start, it actually does it correctly. By the way, what page is it? Page 30, just because I wanted to look at this part. But if we look at this book, the very first sentence in the book, it does it correctly. For nowadays style. Yeah, whereabouts is it? Here it is, the story of the door. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Now, that was never lighted by a smile is a relative clause. I've just been going on about them, and this is a defining relative clause. And defining relative clauses don't have commas, and there's no comma in this book. However, if I take a different version of the book, let me quickly do this. Stop screen sharing and then start screen sharing, but on a different version. And I think it is this one, share. Okay, let's go a little bit closer so you can see this, that there certainly is a comma after countenance in this version, yeah, that was never lighted by a smile. Now, this is not modern style at all. You mustn't use a comma before a that relative clause, because a that relative clause is a defining relative clause. But I just wanted to show you this to prove that different versions of the book will have different punctuation. This version is the older version that's more original, you know, it's more faithful to the original, but it's not how we punctuate nowadays, which is precisely why other versions will lose that comma before the that. You can find the same in Jane Austen right at the start of, I think it's Pride and Prejudice, where she's got commas before her that, defining relative clauses. So in the past, people often did that. But it's not the style nowadays. It's not what they tell you to do, certainly not. So I just thought I'd mention that, because I think it's important to understand that different books are punctuated in different ways. So let's come back to the original text that we were looking at, because that one is the one which I want to look at. I think it's punctuated in a more modern way. And of course, I want to show you modern modern ideas about punctuation. How are things punctuated nowadays? So I want to show you, look at this part, this sentence here. This letter was written in an odd upright hand and signed Edward Hyde. Now here, why have we got a comma? We've got a comma because we've got two adjectives listed, yeah, with no conjunction between them. And so we need, if they're equal adjectives, and we do mean an upright hand and an odd hand, he's using them as coordinate adjectives, which just means equal adjectives. If you can swap them round, then you need a comma between them. So this is interchangeable adjectives. This is why we need a comma between them. Okay, and signed Edward Hyde. Now, I must admit that colon is a little bit unusual for modern style, so I don't think you'll often see it. Colons nowadays are usually before explanations or lists, and really the colon means namely. It doesn't work so well here as namely. And it's signified, comma, briefly enough, comma. So why do we have commas here around briefly enough? Well, briefly enough, if you look at the ly on the end of brief, you can see an adverb, yeah? And I'm sure you agree that briefly is more important than enough, yeah? Because enough describes how briefly. And so briefly is the head word, which means this is adverbial. This is an adverbial interruption. And adverbial interruptions can be they're really mobile, like conjunctive adverbs are. You can move them anywhere around in the sentence. And I must admit, whether to comma them or not is up to the writer. He could have left these two out and said it signified briefly enough that the writer's benefactor. Yeah, it's up to you with an adverbial whether you feel the break deserves the comma. Is it a strong enough break? And that's why commas, yeah, some of them are up to you, many of them in fact, but it's up to you whether you decide. They are often commaed, the adverbial interruptions, and so Robert Louis Stevenson has decided to put these two in. That the writer's benefactor, comma, Dr. Jekyll, comma. So what have we got here? Well, we've got an A positive. Yeah, this is renaming. This is like Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. Yeah, I always use that example. It's a boring example. It's a terrible example. I'll try and think of something else. Maybe Mr. Filch, the caretaker. That's better. Is an A positive because Mr. Filch is the caretaker of Hogwarts. So we're renaming a noun phrase with another noun phrase, which means we've got an A positive. So in this small bit of writing, we've already seen listed adjectives, we've seen interrupting adverbials, and now we're seeing an A positive. And of course, it's a non-defining A positive. So for that reason, we've got it in commas, okay? And then we've got whom he had so unworthily repaid for 1,000 generosities. So what is this? Well, it's one of our relative pronouns, who, which, that, whose, whom. So it's a relative clause. We didn't have to wait a long time to hit a non-defining relative clause. Yeah, and so this is another grammatical structure that you really ought to be using in your writing. Sometimes you really ought to, because if you're never using relative clauses, I think your writing will read really strangely anyway. And so they ought to be in there somewhere. I'm sure they probably already are. Okay, so we got commas around the non-defining relative clause. And then, so Dr. Jekyll need labour under no alarm for his safety. He need labour under no alarm for his safety. That is subjunctive, yeah, but it's not Dr. Jekyll needs, it's he need labour under no alarm for his safety. So that is a form of subjunctive there. So again, he's using, subjunctive was more common in the past. I would say it's disappearing from the language, but it's another grammatical structure, and he's using it already, yeah? So need labour under no alarm for his safety. I won't go into subjunctive at the moment. If you do want to learn more about subjunctive, please check out my video on subjunctive, because there's a lot of information there. And then we've got need labour under no alarm for his safety, comma, as he had means of escape on which he placed a sure dependence. And that on which is another relative clause. Yeah, so we've got two relative clauses in this long sentence. Now, as is a subordinating conjunction, which maybe makes you think, okay, so why have we commaed off this subclause if it's on the end, if it's not before the main clause? Why does it need to be commaed? Well, there is a class I've done on a comma before because, and I would say that the same rule applies to as, which means because sometimes, and since, which means because sometimes. If you have a negative main clause, like Dr. Jekyll need labour under no alarm, that's a negative main clause. You very often, you really ought to use a comma before you hit the because clause, if the because or the as or the since clause explains why. And this does explain why Dr. Jekyll need labour under no alarm. The reason why is that he had means of escape on which he placed a sure dependence. Yeah, and so that comma there before the final subclause, it does kind of need to be there, yeah. Okay, and if you want to find out more about comma before because, try Grammar Girl. She's got a great explanation of when to use a comma before because, and it's certainly why, well, it certainly justifies this comma before as. Okay, then we've got the lawyer likes this letter well enough, semicolon. It put a better colour on the intimacy than he had looked for, semicolon. And he blamed everyone, and he blamed himself for some of his past suspicions. Now, notice that you've got main clause, semicolon, main clause, semicolon, and main clause. You've got three main clauses here listed, and he's using semicolons to separate the main clauses here. And so again, yeah, do use a wide range of punctuation like semicolons, colons, commas, hyphens, apostrophes. Yeah, we had I think we had his letter above something. But anyway, I'm sure there's an apostrophe somewhere up there if I look hard enough for it. But do use a range of punctuation. Okay, so we've got those. And by the way, if the writer had used a comma instead of a semicolon, that would be a comma splice. And that's perhaps why this one's got a semicolon. I'm not sure if it's Robert Louis Stevenson or somebody later, a later editor. I'm not sure, probably a later editor. But this is the way it's punctuated here. And you can see it's got good reason for it. Okay, so then we've got I burned it, comma. That comma's there for direct speech. Notice it's inside the speech marks because replied Jekyll comes afterwards. But then we've got replied Jekyll, comma, and it's outside the speech marks because it's before the next bit of direct speech. So everything about how we use commas in direct speech is right there for everybody to see. You don't really need to know much more than that. But that bit there explains all about commas with direct speech. Okay, and then we've got the same down here. It's inside because was the reply comes afterwards. Well, comma, I shall consider. Now, well is like an interjection, this eighth part of speech, which is unlike all the others because it doesn't really fit into clauses and phrases. It's just all on its own. It's like wow, or well, or damn. Now, you might argue that well is an adverb and not an interjection. It's kind of one or the other. I'm not going to get into that. But either one, it needs a comma. Yeah, when we have interjections, then we carry on a sentence where you need a comma. And whenever we have an adverb, like an adverbial at the front, quite often we use a comma. So that's a good reason for using that one. Then we've got direct speech. And then we've just got a semicolon. No, sorry. Firstly, this colon. And now one word more. Namely, it was Hyde who dictated. So this colon works well as our namely colon, yeah? It basically means namely, this colon. Now, I'm going to stop here, although perhaps we'll do a little bit more in a second on some more text. But I like to do this every day. I like to take a text and analyze the commas, analyze the parts of speech, analyze the phrases and clauses, because it's how you improve your understanding of language. And it certainly makes you aware of all the different tools you have at your disposal as a writer. If we examine the texts that the greats have written, we learn a lot. Okay, so I'm going to be doing this a lot throughout the week. Please, if you like these classes, do head over to my website, skypelessons.com. Over there, you can see it in the bottom left-hand corner. Okay, thanks for watching, everybody. Hope to see you all soon.